When is a position battle not really a position battle? When everybody's going to get some snaps, but some will earn more than others. I'll explain what that means today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, July 16th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today, our episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, training camp begins for the New York Jets next week, and part of any training camp are position battles. But some position battles aren't really position battles from the standpoint that there are enough snaps for everybody, and really what you're determining is who gets more snaps. You know, there might be a situation where certain player, everybody's going to get a certain share of snaps, but depending on who comes out ahead in training camp, one player may earn more snaps than others. We're going to talk about some of the position battles that aren't really position battles the New York Jets have on today's show. And I think one of the most intriguing position battles that's not really a position battle comes at the wide receiver position. And we know Garrett Wilson is going to be the go-to guy on offense. And hopefully Mike Williams is healthy enough to be ready for week one. We talked a little bit about that on yesterday's show. At this point, it seems like signs are pointing towards Mike Williams being ready for the start of the season. But the question becomes, who takes the number 3 wide receiver spot? And there are really 3 contenders for that role. And I think all 3 of them will at least see some degree of playing time this year. You have 2 guys you could argue are sort of incumbents in Allen Lazard and Xavier Gipson. You know, Lazard, of course, very highly paid player and very big disappointment in year one. Xavier Gipson, an undrafted free agent last year, made his biggest mark on special teams week one when he returned a punt for a touchdown in overtime against the Buffalo Bills. Outside of that, saw a fair share of playing time, did not do a whole lot with it. Thrown into a tough spot, though. Whenever you put in an undrafted rookie into a situation where he's got to play a lot, usually it's not going to go well because, undrafted players are undrafted for a reason. It's not that they lack talent. It's that, they typically have a lot that needs to be refined in their game. And I think part of the hope for the Jets last year was that Xavier Gipson, may not have produced a whole lot, but maybe the snaps, maybe the reps will do him some good. But you also have the guy the Jets traded up for in the 3rd round this year, Malachi Corley, guy the Jets were very highly focused on. The Jets stated that he was their number 4 receiver on their draft board. And normally, in many cases, you don't really believe that. But I mean, there's plenty to suggest Jets were trying to move up in the 2nd round to get Corley. It seems like they were very focused on him. They think he could be an excellent player. And again, I think all 3 of these guys are going to have some sort of role on the team. Lazard, like it or not, is a favorite target of Aaron Rodgers. Now, there's rumors, will the Jets look to make him part of a salary dump? I don't think any of those rumors have really picked up a ton of steam yet. Rodgers likes him a lot. He's probably going to be on the team unless the Jets can deal him, which I think is unlikely. Rodgers thinks he's got good chemistry with Lazard. Does he really? That's a matter for debate. What does Lazard really bring to the table? Good question. He's big. Does he really, impose his will the way he should at his size? Is he a guy who, is strong against press coverage? Is he a guy who's a very good contested catch receiver? Well, the top contested catch guys in the league come down with the ball around 60% of the time when they're throwing the ball in a contested catch situation. Lazard, for the course of his career, comes down with the ball under 40% of the time. So, guy who's despite his size, not very good in contested catch situations, but the Jets are paying him a lot of money, and Rodgers likes him, so I'm guessing he'll see his share of playing time. He's an inconsistent blocker, but he's a willing blocker. Not many wide receivers are really great blockers. Lazard has the reputation for being a great blocker at receiver, I think, again, because he's big, and I think people just assume because you're big, you're a great blocker. But Lazard does have some highlight reel blocks, and I do think that there's an argument to be made if Lazard focuses on his technique. Maybe he can help the Jets out. Maybe he can kind of become like a hybrid type receiver tight end where you give him tougher blocking assignments the receiver usually doesn't get. And, you force the other team to put an extra corner on the field, take a linebacker off, put a corner on the field because Lazard's out there. Maybe Lazard gets a tougher blocking assignments and, you can execute your run game at a higher level. Maybe that's where Lazard comes into play this year. You have Malachi Corley, who the Jets just drafted, who, is essentially, the best way to describe him is a running back playing wide receiver, guy who caught a lot of screens, a guy who's very tough to bring down with the ball in his hands. Guy who really does not run a very refined route tree, and which might be an understatement at this point. Now, of course, there's the matter of have you done something in college and can you do it in the pros? Sometimes you're not asked to do something in college, but you're very capable of doing it in the pros. Corley could be a quick learner. He could pick up a very developed route tree very quickly. It's going to be tough, though. Aaron Rodgers is famous for being a guy who demands a lot out of receivers. There's a lot of talk. Rodgers is tough on rookie receivers, and it's true. But I think it's true in a broader context that he expects his receivers to play with perfection. He's the type of quarterback who, I don't want to say, I'm not sure if the term doesn't suffer fools as easily as appropriate here, because anybody who plays wide receiver in the NFL is very good and very smart. But Rodgers expects perfection out of a lot of his receivers, and there are moments where he connects with young receivers. There are moments where he will hit a big pass to a young receiver. There are even some young receivers who have thrived with Rodgers, but he has a reputation for being a guy it takes a couple of years to get going with. And that's because, he expects perfection in his receivers. A young guy like Corley who's trying to pick up the route tree, it's conceivable he could pick it up very quickly, but it's also conceivable, maybe the Jets hold him back on gadget plays this year. Maybe he's a guy the Jets just try and get the ball on, end arounds, on some screens, get him the ball in space, but don't ask him to run a ton of complex routes, because when you're working in the slot, a lot of your routes are what's known as option routes, where you're essentially reading the leverage of the defender. And when the corner is playing the slot, he can either take away the inside or the outside based on the way his body is positioned at the snap. And the receiver, essentially, if the corner is positioned inside, he breaks outside. If he positioned outside, the receiver breaks inside. Those things are tough to pick up on. They're highly based on timing. There can be no false steps because the quarterback's going to throw the ball where he's expecting the receiver to be. It's a lot for Corley to learn, but Corley certainly could be a guy who benefits the Jets offense with the ball in his hands. With a guy who you just get, you design handoffs for him, you design screens for him, like Western Kentucky did in college, and maybe he produces that way. And then Gibson, who we talked about, guy who doesn't really have the build to play outside, I don't think. How much has he picked up over the course of the offseason? One of the things that's always tricky to figure out is how a guy is going to improve from year to year, because we don't really get to see the offseason practices. Gibson was a guy who did have a little bit of buzz around him during the offseason program. That doesn't always mean a whole lot. I always caution against reading too much into the offseason program. But, sometimes a guy really improves from year one to year two. And sometimes the first time you spot it is in the offseason program. Will that be the case with Gibson? I don't know, but that shows you what you've got as far as, when we're talking about battling for playing time behind Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams. You've got these three guys, and all of them bring a little something different to the table. I think because all three bring a little something different to the table, all three of them will see some snaps, but there are only so many snaps to go around, especially when you have two guys who are really locked into the top two roles at receiver. So in some ways, it's what do the Jets want? In some ways, it's how much can these guys show? Can Lazard bounce back from a very disappointing season? Can Gibson grow from year one to year two? Can Corley pick things up quickly, moving into a much more complex offense in the NFL? These are some of the questions the Jets will begin to answer in training camp. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the guys standing next to one of the most important players on the team. We know the Jets are pretty good at defensive tackle with Quinnen Williams there. The question is, what is going to happen next to Quinnen Williams? And we'll talk about that continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. Therapy has many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we are talking about position battles in training camp, but I don't know that you can properly call them position battles because really more battles for a bigger share of snaps when everybody's going to get some playing time. You can't really say that, you're battling for a spot the way like a quarterback position battle may play out, where where one guy who wins it's going to get 100% of the snaps and the guy who loses is going to get 0. It's not going to work out exactly that way for the New York Jets this year. A lot of different positions. We talked about the wide receiver spot. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball, which I think it's still fair to say, despite all the big moves the Jets made on offense this offseason, the defensive side of the ball is an area that is the stronger part of the team. And one of the reasons it's a strong part of the team is they have a lot of top-notch players. One of them is Quinnen Williams. In fact, Quinnen Williams at the defensive tackle spot, you got to feel pretty good with what you have in the middle of the defensive line. After Quinnen Williams, though, it feels like there's a bit of a drop-off. And I think that this is like kind of by design. I think the way the Jets have built their team is with the mindset that Quinnen Williams is just going to make everybody around him better. Now, why do I say that? Well, last year, Jets signed this journeyman defensive tackle, Quinton Jefferson, just turned 30. Not a bad player by any stretch of the imagination, but, a guy who's bounced around the league, a guy who's not spectacular. And he posted a career high with 6 sacks at 30 years old. Last year, Solomon Thomas, a guy who was really a disappointment as a number 3 overall pick by the San Francisco 49ers in 2017. He posted a career high 5 sacks, playing next to Quinnen Williams. Quinnen Williams draws so much attention, and ESPN has actually mapped this out, that Quinnen Williams drew double teams approximately 70% of the snaps he played last year against the pass. So, on any given offensive snap, there are 5 offensive linemen and typically 4 pass rushers. That means one guy can be double teamed on any snap, 5 versus 4. So you have one guy who gets double teamed, 3 guys who get one-on-ones. Quinnen Williams was the guy who got double teamed 70% of the time he was on the field last year. And if you're wondering how that compares, the top defensive tackles in the league generally it's in the range of 60s, maybe the low 60s. Quinnen Williams was pretty high up there among defensive tackles who were successful last year at getting to the quarterback. So the Jets let Jefferson walk in free agency, just as they let Sheldon Rankins walk a year ago. Sheldon Rankins was a guy who I think really benefited in 2022 from Quinnen Williams' breakout season, and the Jets let him walk over the course of last offseason. And, I don't think they really missed a beat, even though I did like Rankins. So the question is, who will step in next to Quinnen Williams? And I think the guy they really have their eye on is Javon Kinlaw. And Kinlaw was a guy who was drafted in the first round by the San Francisco 49ers when Robert Saleh was the defensive coordinator. So there's ample evidence to suggest Saleh really thinks that there's something to unlock here. And the normal disclaimers apply. And, I usually don't like this argument because it's so easy to use and there's so many disappointments in the first round. But, you can always go back to the argument. He was drafted in the first round. Maybe there's something under the surface. And last year, he started to, for the first time, maybe show that he can get to the quarterback. It was not a spectacular year by any stretch of the imagination, but he did pretty decently in a situational role for San Francisco, or at least he was decent at getting to the quarterback. He wasn't as strong as a run defender. Well, what do the Jets have behind him? They brought in a free agent from Arizona, Leki Fatu, and they also brought Solomon Thomas back. Now, again, we're going back to what I said. We know Robert Saleh likes to rotate the defensive linemen in and out. We know he likes to keep guys fresh. We know Quinnen Williams is probably not going to get a full snap total. He's not going to get a full share of snaps. He's not going to play 80 to 90% of the snaps. He'll probably be in like the 65 to 70% range. So these other guys are all going to get an opportunity. And much like the wide receivers, I think it depends on, what the Jets value. If they want somebody who can just flat out get after the quarterback, Kinlaw might be the guy, or maybe Solomon Thomas will see an increased share of playing time. I think that based on the contract Kinlaw got, which is around $7 million guaranteed, he'll probably have the first crack at getting a lot of playing time. But it all depends on how well you perform. And as you know, in the NFL, it's a results-oriented league. So, the guys who the team spent a lot to bring in. The guys who got big contracts are the guys who were early draft picks. They tend to get the first crack, but it's all about producing from that point. If somebody goes out and plays really well, they end up earning a spot. Bryce Huff was a good example of that. He was an undrafted free agent, but he eventually earned his spot over guys who maybe the Jets were a little bit more decorated, who the Jets brought in because he performed. If you're looking for more of a guy who I guess profiles as a run stopper, even though I don't know he's been that great as a run stopper through his career, during his time in Arizona, but Fatu could be that guy. So Fatu, I think, is more of the replacement for Al Woods. I think that the replacement for Quentin Jefferson is Kinlaw, and Solomon Thomas is back. And that's kind of like if you're trying to compare the trio from last year's trio behind Quentin Williams, that's kind of where you'd go. Where Kinlaw is the Jefferson, Solomon Thomas is the Solomon Thomas. Not a hard one to get. And Fatu is the Al Woods. And Al Woods was brought in, I think, to kind of help with the run defense. I think the Jets liked having Big Al out there before he got injured relatively early in the season, but he was a guy you could stick out there. He wasn't really much of a pass rusher. He was more of a space occupier. And, sometimes those defensive tackles are very effective, and especially on a defense where, by and large, the Jets are focused on speed, which means playing with smaller personnel, because smaller personnel tends to be faster than bigger personnel. Having one big guy out there can kind of help clog up run lanes and, slow down the other team's rushing attack. So question comes down to, and a lot of these will come down to opponents. They'll come down to game situations. In a game where the Jets are leading, you'll see more the two pass rushers more. You'll see Thomas, you'll see Kinlaw more than you see Fatu. In a game where the Jets are behind and trying to shut down the run, Fatu will probably get a bigger role. But these are projections based on the skill set. These guys have an opportunity in training camp in the preseason to show that they can do more. If Kinlaw, and again, I'm really focused on Kinlaw because of how much money the Jets gave him. Kinlaw shows that he's become sturdier against the run. He could earn a spot as like the other de facto starter next to Quentin Williams. If Fatu shows he's developed some sort of pass rush moves, maybe there's a spot for him to earn more playing time. We're talking on the margins here because, again, everybody's going to see their fair share of snaps. But the question is, who can improve at the areas where they're deficient at? We know the areas where these guys are relatively strong at, but who's, who over the course of the offseason has been able to improve the areas where they're relatively weak? And I think that will determine a lot about who gets playing time next to Quentin Williams. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll keep our attention on the defensive side of the ball. We'll turn our attention to the spot which many prognosticators think is the weakest on either side of the ball for the New York Jets. It's the back line of defense. It did not hurt them that much last year. You don't really have a ton of changes on paper. Maybe the Jets will sign somebody, but you have guys who are intriguing prospects. Maybe one will bounce back from injury. Maybe some of the others will grow. We'll discuss who we're talking about as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. Yankees got off to a great start this year, not going so great lately. Mets got off to a rough start this year. They seem to have bounced back a little bit. But if you want to go see either local team play, Gametime is the place to go. You can get great deals last minute. I've used Gametime myself, not for baseball, but I've used it for tennis, for college football, for Broadway musicals. Every time I've used it last minute, I've just pulled out my phone, opened the app, and found a great deal at prices that can't be beat. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. We're talking about position battles for the Jets, but we're using position battles as a very loose term because players at these positions who are battling it out for snaps, they're all going to get some degree of playing time. The question is who can earn more than other guys. And the last position we're going to talk about is safety. And I think we're going to see plenty of 3 safety looks for the Jets this year. In fact, last year, I think that was the plan. I think the plan was, after they traded for Chuck Clark, was to play a lot of looks with Tony Adams, Jordan Whitehead, and Clark in the lineup. And that goes back to something I mentioned in the last segment about how Robert Saleh likes to play small and fast on defense. And in many ways, a 3 safety look is essentially replacing a linebacker with a guy who's smaller and faster, because safeties tend to be smaller and faster than linebackers. So you take off a linebacker, you put in a safety. It's known as big nickel. And that's because nickel is 5 defensive backs on the field. Normally, when you have 5 defensive backs on the field, it's 3 corners and 2 safeties. A big nickel is 3 safeties and 2 corners. It's big nickel because safeties tend to be bigger than corners. So essentially, you're trying to get the best of both worlds when you go big nickel, because safeties tend to tackle better than corners, but they tend to be rangier than linebackers, tend to be faster than linebackers. So that's the idea behind the big safety look, big nickel look. And the Jets, once again, this year, I think they're going to try it. Adams will be back year 2 as a starter. Jets, I'm sure, are hoping he puts it together this year. He was very hit or miss last year. I mean, he had some. Tony Adams was a guy who was responsible for a lot of big plays, and some of them were really good for the Jets, and some of them were not so good for the Jets. I think the Jets will be looking for more consistency from him this year. Clark is back after, unfortunately suffering an injury last offseason that cost him the whole year. You would expect that he'll be back at full strength this year. And then Ashton Davis, who, had something of a renaissance last year. And I mean, I don't want to overstate how good Ashton Davis was, because I feel like sometimes, we go a little overboard with these role players. But Ashton Davis, he played a lot close to the line of scrimmage. He was lined up either in the box or in the slot an awful lot. And I think they kind of unlocked something there, because Davis, when the Jets drafted him out of Cal in 2020, the idea was he was a guy with a lot of speed, a lot of range. So I think originally they thought he was a guy who'd be good in the back of the defense because he could cover so much ground, but he really struggled. I did research on this. And in 2021, if you took away missed tackles Davis made that resulted in a 30-yard gain, you'd knock a full half a yard off the Jets' average rushing per carries attempt defensively. So Davis was really a problem for the Jets in 2021. He essentially added an extra half yard through his missed tackles that they allowed per carry. The Jets decided to move him closer to the line of scrimmage in 2023, and it worked out really well. He was able to be more aggressive. And I think part of it's when he's playing closer to the line of scrimmage, that means he's not the last line of defense. That means his aggressiveness doesn't hurt you. His aggressiveness can only do you well if he's playing close to the line of scrimmage, because he makes a big play. He's got the potential to make big plays. But if he's a little out of control and misses his tackle, there's still somebody behind him to clean it up. I think they kind of figured out how to use Ashton Davis a year ago. The question is now, can Davis do more? And this goes back to what we've been talking about really for this entire episode. The question is, what can these guys add to their game? Can they bring something else to the table? Can Xavier Gipson add route running? Can Malachi Corley add route running? Talking about the defensive tackles. Can, Javon Kinlaw become a better run stopper? These are the questions that will tell us whether these guys can get more playing time. And at the safety position, can Ashton Davis hold up better deep now? He's kind of got down the playing in the box part of the safety position. Now, can you trust him to line up deep and not have a lot of problems back there? Because if you do, then he could potentially be one of the top 2 safeties on the team. Adams was very up and down last year. Clark's coming off a serious injury. I think you'd be fine with a duo with Adams and Clark. But could Davis become something a little bit more? Again, at some level, maybe it's not as big of a question as we make it out to be, because I'm sure the Jets will want to play plenty of 3 safety looks this year. It's kind of in Robert Saleh's wheelhouse. If you followed Saleh, they've converted a number of safeties to linebackers during his time here. And even in cases like Davis, they haven't announced it, but they've kind of done it unofficially. So you'll see plenty of 3 safety looks this year. The big question is, who gets more playing time? There's really only 2 safeties who can play full time. The question is, who's the third safety? The third safety is still going to see his fair share of snaps, but may not get as many snaps. Who will that be? And that's something I think will be determined in training camp and through the preseason. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with our weekly mailbag show. Please send in your questions.